Hello, everyone. My name is Spencer Walsh. Welcome to today's show. We have a good one for you, as always. And on the show today, we are keeping you up to date with all the latest. It is one of those days where we got a bunch of just kind of little stories to dart around. Really some horrific instances of massacres throughout Gaza today. Israel has killed Palestinians in the latest shelling on homes, cars, markets, and farmland throughout the Gaza Strip. We'll give you some other kind of key points of the war, including a really brutal attack on an ambulance that was condemned by various international agencies the world over. Also, we will be taking a look at a really, really remarkable situation coming out of Ecuador today, where the president has had to get back on TV, regain control really of the country, and declare war on gangs after a really just insane period of, multiple days of just absolute chaos of gang violence declared. All right, so yeah, we'll give you the latest on all of that. Meanwhile, a new analysis by The Intercept shows the New York Times, Washington Post, and LA Times coverage of Israel's war on Gaza showed a consistent bias against Palestinians, according to an Intercept analysis of major coverage. Probably the three biggest newspapers in the country there, so pretty important to get a good sense of what they're saying and the narrative that they are coming from. And finally, we'll hear a little piece from, or actually an interview by Daniel Denvir. We'll read a little bit of his interview in Jacobin with Mohammed El-Kurd. All right, yeah, I'm not going to exactly say it's going to be a completely fun show, but it will definitely be a very informative show. So thank you so much for joining us here this evening. So Israel continues really its war on Gaza, and we start with some of the just general latest here. Israel has recently bombed near Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital in Deir al-Balah in central Gaza, killing at least 8 people. Medical sources have told Al Jazeera. This is the hospital that we talked about on the last episode, where we had seen multiple, staff members and, I think it was like 500-600 patients being forced to leave the hospital, and no really update or knowledge yet on their whereabouts, which is really a horrifying situation. So another Israeli strike in Rafah had killed at least 5, according to Al Jazeera correspondents. The latest attack comes as Israel has intensified bombing and ground incursions in central and southern Gaza recently, with at least 147 people killed in the past day. In the occupied West Bank, Israeli forces have launched a series of raids and are targeted with explosive devices and gunfire kind of sporadically by Palestinian civilians, and there's not really any kind of really organized militia of any major source right now in the West Bank. So I think it's kind of important to understand, but just kind of very sporadic, kind of low-level fighting, and kind of just Molotov cocktails being thrown, explosives being set up, and things like that, but still incredibly kind of valiant resistance to these really daily incursions. Or maybe it's every other day, I don't know. But last time we talked about a shooting in Tulkarem, which is in the West Bank. So there's always some really ridiculous stuff going on a daily basis. There's no Hamas in control of these people. By all accounts, were not involved in October 7th. So there is going to be no real under this new operation to justify, to do what they're doing in the West Bank. But, the real case of this and why Israel continues to do what they always have been doing in the West Bank is to continue, obviously, the expansion of their illegal settlements. Anyway, so we do want to get to this meeting here as well. Antony Blinken, I guess, met recently with in what was apparently a pretty intense meeting with Mahmoud Abbas, and that's that's how it was called. Of course, in the eyes of as there were protests outside, Blinken met with the Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas in Ramallah with protests outside. So the death toll for the Palestinians is up to 23,357 people and more than 59,410 wounded in Israeli attacks on Gaza since the 7th of October. And the revised death toll from the October, I swear, it keeps getting lower all the time, stands at October, from The revised death toll from the Israeli attack against Israelis on October 7th by Hamas stands at 1,139. All right, so the really kind of interesting stuff going on throughout. This actually just in, as we're really just getting a flash of information here to manage all at once. Some pretty breaking news. Russia, China, and Algeria have all abstained from a new resolution in the Security Council calling for a halt to the Houthi attacks on the Red Sea. And again, we've seen a lot of kind of hindering about these Houthi attacks, but very few people willing or able to actually step up to stop them. And I believe there's going to be kind of continued U.S. strikes, as there have been, by the way, on the Houthis for a pretty long period, almost a decade at this point. Really not to, very much effect because, those Saudi Arabian strikes were essentially, U.S. strikes. We give them, we fund and essentially create their entire military out of whole cloth. So, this was strikes. These were strikes that were completely and fundamentally supported for, a long period of time that were incredibly brutal to civilians. Were supported by the United States, and now it looks like they're kind of getting back to their, their old ways of things. But very interestingly here on this resolution, Russia and China not using their veto power, as the U.S. has done to protect Israel, they're not using their veto power here to protect the Houthis. So it kind of shows you that as much as, they're kind of remain silent on this, both Russia and China, these, I wouldn't really say Russia, but, just China not really using its power as this almost the second emerging pole in world politics to say, we are actively going to, pull things like what the U.S. would pull in terms of, vetoing a Security Council resolution to help our friends, as we know, the United States has done countless times on behalf of Israel. The three Russian amendments to draft the UN Security Council condemning the Houthis, though, had failed. So they're presenting amendments to the resolution which calls for Yemen's Houthis to halt attacks shipping on the Red Sea. So voting on the amendment, this is actually Al Jazeera's James Bays reporting for the UN in New York said he did not expect the amendments to pass, but then obviously the whole thing eventually did. Meanwhile, 4 children, including a baby, were killed in an Israeli attack in Rafah. The bodies of 4 young children were taken to Abu Yusuf al-Najjar Hospital in Rafah, where they were laid next to each other. They are from the al-Arjani family. So this is... it's kind of a really, meanwhile, as we take it to Israel here, we continue to see a really ridiculous kind of back and forth, despite myriad comments playing out over the, in Hebrew, reports of, Netanyahu saying that he's continuing voluntary migration, and really just kind of becoming obvious for quite a while now. Netanyahu has come out tonight and made a speech saying that he is not supportive in any way of voluntary migration, just kind of a joke there. The statement contradicts calls from high-ranking ministers that have been actually done in English, including far-right finance minister Bezalel Smotrich. He said, "I want to make a few points absolutely clear. Israel has no intention of permanently occupying Gaza or displacing its civilian population." Again, pretty much, it's not just Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. It's been everybody through up and down the entire government have come out and support this, or said something, similar as there's no civilians in Gaza. They need to be wiped out. We need to, build a beach house in Gaza, something along those lines. And it's pretty much been, and Netanyahu, by all accounts, in Hebrew, has said things very similar, but hasn't really quite said that yet in English. And I think there's someone who I, follow on kind of the Israeli side of Twitter. I'm definitely going to say her name wrong. It's like Noga Tarnopolosky or something like that. And her whole thing, she's like a journalist, I think, in Israel, and her whole big thing is to, find every single possible tweet to find some way to make Netanyahu look bad. Not necessarily from, a pro-Palestinian point of view, but just from a liberal Israeli Jew that just absolutely hates Netanyahu government and wants to see the back of it as soon as possible. It's like, oh, Netanyahu gets too many spray tans during the war. It's that it's definitely the same vein of, liberal opposition to Trump being much more aesthetic based and much less actually based on the policies that he put forth. But either way, she had a very good point. about this, talking about this, Mr. Jekyll in English, or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or whatever. One of them, the nice one's in English, and the mean one is in Hebrew. But it really is. It is a clear act. We know what is going on. We've seen the comments from the government. We've seen the way Israeli public. There is no real, convincing evidence from inside Israel in any form that I have seen that shows that Israel and its citizens are pushing towards moderation. There's been some pushback on Netanyahu, even from the left, for him not being tough enough on the Arabs. There's billboards out there in various places in Israel that say Netanyahu too nice to the Arabs, and what they mean is that he wasn't, he was watching Arabs, but he was watching Arabs in the West Bank, or Palestinians, I should say, in the West Bank, when he should have been watching them in Gaza more intensely. That is the main disagreement they have with that, that he was not brutal enough. So I think it's important there to, it's not some sort of, major sea change in terms of, humanity coming out of Israeli society. Not even close. I think it's very important to realize that. Really shocking statements today. Also, honestly could have led with this. WHO Director Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus has said that he is appalled by reports from the Palestinian Red Crescent Society that an Israeli strike targeted one of his ambulances, killed 4 medical workers and 2 patients. Violence and attacks on health and civilians must end, said the WHO leader in a social media post. Although, again, incredibly, talk about appalling, does not name Israel as the attacker in the statement. And again, what I really want to know from him is what is what will people really get mad at you if you say that? They're just going to be like, yeah, it wasn't us. They're going to call you, anti-Semitic, or say that you're doing blood libel or something. But then, they're just going to move on and continue to do the same thing. There's nothing and they're not going to, WHO is not going to be shut down because, the director said that about Israel. That's just not how that's going to work in any, realistic sense. So it's just how, why is it so hard for him to come out and just say the blatantly obvious? Really just a horrific attack at an ambulance, one of the most horrific parts of the war. So this is the first paragraph of the Palestinian Red Crescent Society report, saying, condemning the Israeli occupation's direct targeting of a PRCS ambulance vehicle, which has resulted in 6 martyrs, including 4 EMS crew members, ambulance driver Youssef Abu Mamar, paramedic Fadi Fouad Almani, and the first responder Islam Abu Riyala, volunteer photographer Fad Abu Kamash. And 2 of the resulting martyrs were casualties being transported for urgent medical attention, and this took place in spite of the fact the medical mission was following the safer access protocol. It just completely, goes on to talk about how it's kind of complete violence of the incomplete violation of the Geneva Convention and all that stuff. But again, as we all have felt increasingly, it just seems as though they're shouting into the void. Hamda Salhout of Al Jazeera had this update on the Israeli War Cabinet meeting. She says, "We know that on the table there are 2 main agenda items." This is again from Al Jazeera. The first is the issue of the captives and their release, and the second is a conversation about what Israelis are hoping to do after the war. There hasn't been any sort of consensus among the Israeli government, although there was a preliminary framework released by Israel's defense minister last week, but there is something that's going to be up for discussion. And the issue of the captive is something that has really been of the utmost importance within Israeli society. The government has had a lot of pressure on it from the public, from the families of the captives, who say that enough time has gone by and that they're simply not a priority to the Israeli government. Just today, you had the cabinet member Benny Gantz come out and say the issue of the captives is the most important goal in the war, but you also have rhetoric from the prime minister himself that all goals of the war are equally important. So, we've kind of seen, I think, a lot of interesting theories that, Netanyahu wants to prolong this war as much as possible. It's a big reason why he's pushing for that second front, just for his own domestic political concerns. He's pushing with that second front to even try and garner more support in a fight against Hezbollah. And meanwhile, Benny Gantz is somebody who is, in tune with a lot of, other major part of Israeli society. Says, hey, we hate the Arabs too, but we need to focus on getting our hostages back. That's incredibly important. And it's going to be humiliating as well if those hostages end up, dying when, we're in Gaza right now. We could have saved. And, the fact that they haven't even successfully brought back a senior hostage or single hostage through any kind of rescue investigation. It's just been through, ceasefires and handing over. Is, I think it's an incredible, humiliation. I think it's definitely an indication, really, that they are not, that's not a focus of the war for them. That's not something they're trying to do or really particularly care about, because it's just like, why would you not? Why would you not push as much as you possibly can to get those various sources, or get the, do anything you can to get the hospitals back. There's continued strikes on Rafah, and just generally some as Israel continues to focus in on the south of Gaza after completely destroying the north. 77 groups have also backed the Biden administration, lawsuit accusing the Biden administration of failing to prevent genocide in Gaza. White House has made a comment on the Houthi Red Sea assaults, calling them escalatory, adding that the U.S. will collaborate with allies on future actions should these attacks persist. Warning them against warning of action against Houthi attacks on the Red Sea, maybe more taking a step up, but again, that action will, by all accounts, be led by the U.S., not by any regional or European action as well. We also have the leaders of Egypt and Jordan advocating collectively for a ceasefire. Both that's Sisi and Abdullah, by the way, who have both not really done anything too concrete to help, Palestinian civilians and just Palestinian people over the, for how the monarchy in Jordan's been in power since, obviously the beginning of Israel, but the various leadership. Sisi has not been a very, super good, friend to the Palestinians, someone who's been very, kind of pulled up by and kind of fallen prey to the kind of devastating influence of the U.S. and by extension Israel. So, it's mostly just words there on that. Apparently, an Israeli delegation has also landed in Cairo this evening for discussions with Egypt on a possible captive release deal. Efforts to discuss a new swap deal were disrupted last week with the assassination of Saleh al-Aruri in Beirut. Also, we have had to see yet another cancellation of the WHO, canceling their sixth medical aid mission due to refusal of guarantees of safety and things like that by Israel. So really disturbing stuff there for sure. And with that being said, though, we kind of giving you the whole whip around. We will come back to Israel and Gaza and all that in just a brief moment, but I do want to get into this situation going on in Ecuador. Really, really remarkable situation going on there. But before we do, I do want to quickly finally do a quick update here on this situation. A poll done of the Arab world saying that a vast majority, I believe something nearing 90%, saw the October 7th attack by Hamas as a legitimate, part of a, resistance operation. And I feel like, we've talked for days and days and days about, the morality and the back and forth of, October 7th, putting in context. Was it moral? Was it immoral? How do you think about it? How do you process it? All that kind of stuff. But I think this really gives us a very, very good indication into the Arabic world and how many people throughout various countries, even countries that have a long time normalized relations with Israel, are incredibly sympathetic to the Palestinian cause and how much they see. And, probably having, a whole entire, I'm not probably, but definitely having a whole entire different information landscape than what we would have in the West or, people in Israel for sure would have. So, it really does show you that this is give you a window into the political climate and definitely give the leaders of those Arabic countries a window into the political climate they're operating under, to know how much broad support is there and, get a sense of the Arab world isn't abandoning Palestine. The people of the Arab world are incredibly supportive of Palestine and see what Hamas is doing as much more of a kind of expression, last resort style expression of anger than any sort of terrorist attack or region destabilizing thing. So it's very important when we talk about, these various countries like Algeria, Morocco, all the countries in North Africa where we see, high majority, kind of Muslim populations, all those different places. It is very, very important to remember there is still massive, massive amounts of support for those places, for Palestine in those places. All right, let's get to Ecuador here. Really remarkable situation taking place in Ecuador at the moment. This is here in the New York Times. A sense of dread took hold in Ecuador on Wednesday, with the streets empty, classes canceled, and many people afraid to leave their homes after the disappearance of 2 gang leaders on Monday set off prison riots, police kidnappings, and on-air storming of a TV station. Really some shocking stuff. I feel like the world I knew before was gone, said Maria Ortega, school teacher in Guayaquil, a sprawling coastal city. You can know how things start, but not how they'll end. It began with violence erupting in prisons across South American country as soldiers surged into a penal compound in Guayaquil after the disappearance of a powerful gang leader, Adolfo Macias, from his cell. So this guy comes in, is arrested, and escaped. Inmates took prison guards captive, and dozens of detainees escaped, including another prominent gang leader. So we don't really know how this original guy got out, but that, set all sorts of chaos off and was viewed as some sort of power grab, or opportunity to grab power by the inmates. Probably, a fair few of them were from the Macias gang. The violence soon spilled over into cities and towns where drug gangs run rampant. Explosions were reported, police officers were kidnapped, and hospitals were seized, and cars were set on fire. People scrambled to get home, jumping on the backs of trucks and as bus services stopped in Guayaquil, and the police and armed people exchanged gunfire, including near a school. At least 11 people died at the end of that bloody day. Throughout the country, according to authorities, including well-known musician Diego Gallardo, who was in his car on the way to pick up his son from school when he was hit with a stray bullet. That's really incredibly sad there. The unrest peaked on Tuesday afternoon when armed men briefly took over TC Television in Guayaquil during a loud broadcast, taking anchors and staff hostage and demanding to deliver a message to the government not to interfere with the mafia. Is essentially saying, this guy's out, we're going to do what we want, so leave us the hell alone. Not long after the country's president, Daniel Noboa, declared an internal armed conflict and directed the military to neutralize the country's 2 dozen gangs, which the government labeled terrorist organizations. The Noboa framed the decision as a watershed moment, saying we are really going to, it's almost a situation of a Honduras with that, that utterly foolish, Bitcoin president who did through an incredibly aggressive, penal policy. One of the very few successful instances of a penal policy cracking down on, drug gangs and things like that. And not even just drugs, but just general organized crime, mafia-related figures, things like that. It was one of the first cases we've seen of just successful ability to crack down on that stuff. It was very, very important, and I think it was very interesting to maybe begin to see President Noboa going in that route. In Ecuador, the presidential declaration was widely seen as a turning point in a crisis that has subsumed the once peaceful nation over the past 2 years, as the country of nearly 18 million has been dominated by an increasingly powerful narco-trafficking industry. International drug cartels from as far as Albania have joined forces with local prison and street gangs, unleashing a wave of violence unlike anything in the country's recent history. Homicide rates have soared to record levels. Saying that a lot of tough rhetoric from the government saying we're not going to back down, we don't negotiate with terrorists, all that kind of stuff. We're not going to let society die slowly, Noboa said here, which is a very interesting situation, but also does have some people worried. Others, kind of viewing it as a slippery slope to a militarized state that targets innocent civilians. Definitely a very possible, outcome of that, and just a intensified security and intensified prison state can get out of hand very, very quickly. So it's important to watch how that has, how this response will take shape as kind of, international, observers here. This is Catherine Casanova, who's a 28-year-old social worker who said her family had been recently attacked by armed men in Guayaquil. Although in the midst of the pain, I want to cling to something that makes me feel a modicum of security. I feel the repercussions of declaring an internal conflict, of militarizing. It will probably be my people who once more are among the dead. So I don't know if she's referring to, a certain ethnic group or, just, poorer, kind of like, working class people or women even, who will end up among the dead. But it seems like, either way, a lot of violence will be coming down the pike in Ecuador. It's a very, very sad situation. Noboa's declaration came on the heels of a proposed referendum that would strengthen or lengthen sentences for crimes like murder and arms trafficking, target money launderers, and create a special court system to protect judges. Many have compared the this is not El Salvador. Oh my gosh. This is not Honduras, El Salvador. This is Nayib Bukele. Many have compared this referendum to the enhanced security moves of Nayib Bukele in his autocratic campaign in El Salvador against drug gangs, a comparison Noboa has made himself. The government's measures are much more aggressive than any previous steps to quell gang violence, said Fernando Carrion of Latin America Faculty for Social Sciences, a regional research and analysis group which studies violence and drug trafficking. The population looks favorably on this decision, he said, but added that tackling such large and entrenched gangs would be challenging. Drawing the military into the conflict, as experts said, could lead to prolonged violence and bloodshed, as it did in Colombia, where Plan Colombia, a U.S.-backed policy that took hold some 20 years ago, have been criticized for treating much of the population as internal enemies. And that was what that social worker was worried about. And I think it's gotten a little bit better in El Salvador, although it's honestly something that I'm not really too familiar with. But either way, an incredibly important and incredibly crazy situation to see is, the video of that live TV studio with cameras rolling being taken over by hostages was just some shocking stuff. All right, we go now to our next story. Apparently, the New York Times and other major papers, including the Washington Post and the LA Times, have been biased against Gaza. What a surprise. This comes after another recent Intercept report where, they revealed that CNN, one of the biggest sources of TV news for people on things like this, these kind of the world international conflicts, their big strategy was to route their coverage to the Jerusalem bureau so it would just be censored by the IDF. And, they'd say things like, a blast may have killed some Palestinians, but we don't know how this blast happened, or maybe who even, caused the blast. Speculating on anything like that, that would be crazy. We'd never want to do anything like that. So it's just like, the kind of ridiculous, back and forth situation, and this kind of language that we see to really obfuscate the Israeli role in the situation. The open source analysis focuses on the first 6 weeks of the conflict from the October 7th Hamas-led attacks that killed 1,139 Israelis and foreign workers on the 24th to the 24th of November, the beginning of the week-long humanitarian truce agreed to by both parties to facilitate hostage exchanges. So you can just go through some of the key findings here. In the NYT, WAPO, or LA Times, the word Israeli or Israel appear more often than Palestine or Palestinian or variations thereof, even as Palestinian deaths far outpaced Israeli deaths. Something I've definitely noticed, hear about these mainstream outlets. There's this continuous, focus on how is Israeli society handling this? How are, the Israeli hostages doing? How is this? Again, this is time as the death toll begins to absolutely skyrocket at a horrific clip. For every 2 Palestinian deaths, Palestinians are mentioned once was the rate. For every Israeli death, Israelis are mentioned 8 times, or at a rate 16 times more per death than that of any Palestinian. So highly emotive terms were always used for the killing of civilians, like slaughter, massacre, and horrific. But they were not really used they were almost exclusively used when referring to the deaths of Israeli civilians who were killed by Palestinians rather than the other way around. When terms appeared in quotes rather than the editorial voice of the publication, they were omitted from the analysis. They could say, that was a horrific massacre of people in the Jenin refugee camp or the Shujaiya refugee camp or any of the hospitals, the Jabalia refugee camp, any of these places where massacres happen on the daily and have been happening on the daily ever since October 7th and before, that even if someone says that to them, that word will be omitted. So it's not just a kind of unconscious bias, is a conscious decision to say, hey, this word looks like it could be too friendly. You really just down to that single word, that single use of an emotive word to make a Palestinian's death seem like it's a big deal and actual tragedy. Those words are meticulously, thoroughly taken out. So the term slaughter was used by editors and reporters to describe the killings of Israelis versus Palestinians 60-1. Massacre was used to describe the killing of Israelis versus Palestinians 125-2. And 36-4 was the split between the ratio split between Israelis and Palestinians, with Israelis being higher there for the use of the word horrific. So you can get a sense of just how much of a just total incredible split there was between the use of these words. And I think the kind of intentional omission there is very big. And we've seen some of these stories, but it's been kind of pointed out on Twitter to just people like being, Palestinian or Israeli children were killed, but Palestinian young people, they won't even use the word children. So you assume it's like a 20-year-old, but it's really like a 2-year-old, that's being killed in Palestine. So really just horrific stuff there in terms of just basic dehumanization of these people. But, when it's so widespread and when billions of people, billions of views, billions of eyeballs, going to these articles over the past, or the 6 weeks of the time period the study was done, opinions were being formed, decisions were being made, among the public, and this stuff, even these small little things have a very, very big deal, and that, that's why they are done. Only 2 headlines out of over 1,100 news articles in the study mention the word children related to Gazan children. And a notable exception, New York Times ran a late November front page story on the historic pace of killings of Palestinian women and children, though the headline featured neither group. Despite Israel's war on Gaza being perhaps the deadliest war for children, almost entirely Palestinian in modern history, there is scant mention of the word children and related terms in the headlines of articles surveyed by The Intercept. Meanwhile, more than 6,000 children were reported killed by authorities in Gaza at the time of the truth, with the number topping well over 10,000 today. So, just really this incredible use of the word children, I think, is just one of the incredible stuff, or one of the more jaw-dropping stuff, or parts of this report. Similarly, when it comes to how the Gaza conflict, by the way, I don't know if I said it right, this report is in The Intercept, but when it comes to how the Gaza conflict translates to hate in the U.S., major papers paid much more attention to anti-Semitic attacks than ones against Muslims, which was, by the way, as we found out, the ACLU now is, ever since October 7th, has been, just counting all Palestinian rallies as anti-Semitic incidents, and then in turn saying they've spiked 350,000% or something like that, which is just really spreading fear at a time where, in my opinion, fear definitely needs to not be spread. So during the period of the Intercept study, the New York Times, Washington Post, and LA Times mentioned anti-Semitism more than Islamophobia 549 times to 79, and this was before the campus anti-Semitism meta controversy that was contrived by Republicans in Congress, which began the week of the 5th of December. So we weren't even talking about, the college students and everything like that until that congressional hearing, which happened, a few weeks after this study concluded. Despite many high-profile instances with both anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim racism during the survey period, 87% of mentions of discrimination were about anti-Semitism versus 13% mentions about Islamophobia, inclusive of related terms. So, again, this shows you all these little, very small and oftentimes intentional decisions by these media outlets. They make a difference, they add up, and they are, fundamental to giving perspective for a lot of people, and especially a lot of, kind of the voting population. You get Gen X, millennials. Like this is how they're getting their information about this conflict, and it may not seem biased. It may not seem, may seem very fair and honest and objective. And this person's saying this, and this person's saying, but these small little words, these small choices, they really do paint an image in people's minds, and that spread out over just even 1,000 articles is an incredibly, it's probably seen by millions or billions of people, is a very big deal. All right, we now are going to go to our last story today, and it is an a little bit of an interview with Mohammed El-Kurd. Just going to read, some of my favorite quotes. He's obviously the Palestinian correspondent for The Nation. Really incredible, just Palestinian thinker, writer, activist, all that stuff. If you want to read one Mohammed El-Kurd article, I forget. It's like, it's not my fault my occupiers are Jewish is essential. Point of that, a really, really interesting piece about, anti-Semitism as it relates to just the general day-to-day of the Palestinian struggle and how Palestinian suffering gets talked about by, the broader people. So it is the... I also recommend you check out this interview on Jacobin.com because it is really, really good. It kind of starts with the framing, talking about how if we're consuming television channels, we'd be hearing about an Israel-Hamas war, but that's not really an accurate framing of what's happening on the ground. It does take a very, very big deal. This is an Egyptian and Israeli imposed siege blockade that is largely controlled by Israel. It's a siege of land, air, and water. We often hear this narrative that Israel pulled out of the Gaza Strip in 2005, that there are not any settlements left since 2005, but this ignores the fact that Israel controls every aspect of life on the Gaza Strip. A few months ago, an Israeli minister called Itamar Ben-Gvir said something, about how he was talking to an Arab TV reporter, and he said, I'm sorry, Mohammed, but my family's life is more important than your freedom. And his remarks garnered a lot of outrage around the world, even from American politicians who said, how dare he say this? When I heard these remarks that are absolutely racist, I did not raise an eyebrow because these remarks happen to be very factual. According to Israeli legislation, blatantly saying that Israel is not a state for all its people. It's a state for Jewish people, period, wherever they may be across the world. It is a racist state according to Israeli legislation, and those living under Israeli rule. The lives of my family are absolutely worth less than the Israeli families just by how things are governed. This is absolutely the most important departure point we must use to understand things on the ground. And as I said, it's not just about marginal context. It's the very answer to everything. Now, in the past 30-something days, as of the 14th of November 2023, we have seen Israelis engage in a genocidal campaign of bombardment on the Gaza Strip. So again, really kind of just informing, kind of catch up all throughout this, talking about how the Great March will return and all these efforts at nonviolent resistance that were repeatedly cast as anti-Semitic or just despicable or just singling out the only Jewish state and stuff like that, and how they just were taken out of the bounds of political respectability, which again leads to more violent movements gaining strength. I think he then kind of goes interesting on to talk about the war aims of Israel and how they are framed. He says, we know that Israel cannot take out Hamas militarily because the Israeli military has been a military that engages in the murder and slaughter of people from the sky. We've seen that most clearly in the October 7th, response. It's clear as day. If Solomon engages in ground battles, it just can't. It can continue to drop 2,000 bombs on residential buildings, flattening them and killing thousands and thousands of civilians in the process. And I mean, by Israeli estimates, it has killed less than 100 Hamas fighters. This is again as of November, but it's not much more now. That's by its own estimates, it's killed over 11,000 Palestinian civilians. And that it is somehow okay in the global landscape. That's viewed as okay. That's viewed as acceptable. It's not viewed as just a general, absolutely screaming moral outrage. But also, not only can Israel not take out Hamas militarily, it's going to create now more animosity and more desire for armed resistance because we know that violence begets violence. And if the Palestinian people are told that your non-violent resistance is going to be penalized and criminalized, and you're literally going to be killed, as we saw in the Great March of Return, or intentionally maimed, and that if you try to go to the ICC, we're going to impose sanctions on the ICC, and if you're going to speak up, we're going to tarnish you as an anti-Semite. What else will people turn to but the rifle? That's not a minor detail. And I know this is uncomfortable for many people listening here, but it's something that needs to be reckoned with. Otherwise, we are naive to think that anything that's going to come out of this Israeli campaign is anything but more death and destruction. Now, another thing that the Israelis have been hoping to achieve in this campaign is to delegitimize the Palestinian resistance as a whole. Hamas, regardless of what I think of it, regardless of what you all think of it, Hamas is a political Islamist movement that has both a political wing and a military wing, which is, Qassam brigades is the military wing, as we all No, but it's also very clearly a political wing as well. It's been classified by many Western governments as a terrorist organization, but we also know that the Western governments have classified many people and organizations as terrorist organizations. Hamas may not represent my own beliefs or my own political views, but to depoliticize it by constantly synonymizing it and conflating it with people like Taliban and ISIS and Al-Qaeda as some kind of rabid, agendaless group that is just bloodthirsty and eager to kill as many people as possible is disingenuous and does lead to the dehumanization of Palestinians. Talking about kind of the military solution here. She says it's quite bizarre that a slogan like "from the river to the sea" can garner so many headlines and provoke so much discussions. We are often caught in these discursive battles where what we say is interrogated and put into a corner, and we have to apologize for our language. And meanwhile, their language, their very actions, their very systemic, institutionalized, legalized actions can run without scrutiny. I mean, they have been running on "from the river to the sea" doctrine Israel has for a long, long time. That has just, completely not been acknowledged at all whatsoever. He goes then to talk about the response in America as well. He has some very interesting things to say about, bringing back an internationalized American left and how so many things from, the troop or the cop that was killed George Floyd was trained in Israel and the deadly exchange and all that stuff, and how many things and systems of oppression and, these very, just imperialist countries are interlinked. It's a very, very interesting and fascinating interview that I'm kind of, speeding through here, but I just want to get one answer in full, asking what does a free Palestine look like? This is something that, very interesting to hear him answer, and Daniel Denvir asks him that. So Elkert says, so to start off, I think I like a lot of this. I think like a lot of this is a bit of a distraction to talk about. This talk about the two-state, one-state, what happens to the settlers, there's this idea that we're going to throw them all into the sea, etc. All these hypotheticals, I can engage them from today until tomorrow. But what I think is important to look at the facts, it's important to look at the facts that are on the ground. There are Palestinians between the river and the sea. They're subjected to various forms of colonial violence, and there are Israeli settlements all over the West Bank. Actually, George W. Bush, hilariously, many years ago described the West Bank as looking like Swiss cheese because there's just all these little islands encircled by colonies and military outposts. These are the facts on the ground. And again, I always hesitate. Sometimes I even ridicule the question about what happens to the settlers in a liberated Palestine because so often the people asking these questions, I don't think they wake up and wash their face and look in the mirror and think, I wonder what's happening to the 6 million Palestinian refugees now living and forced to live in refugee camps, lingering in refugee camps, or who can only go to Palestine through photographs that their parents and their grandparents have. Tons of people across America, people forced into refugee camps in Jordan and Lebanon and Egypt, the incredibly, the suffering Palestinian diaspora who has been kicked out of land is also very, very much ignored and kind of expressing this kind of BS about, what happens to settlers? What happens? Is a little bit kind of disingenuous. But however, he says, there's this elevation of the lives and the feelings and the sentiments and the desires and the sovereignty and the location of the settlers over the lives of the natives. However, I can say this. I don't have a desire to cause a genocide against any people. And for the people and I think this is a great sentence here, and for the people to hear a phrase like "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," and consider it a call to genocide, that is much more a reflection of their own tendencies and impulses than it is a reflection of mine. That I could not have said it any better myself there about the, reactions, the very interesting, shall we say, reactions to Palestine will be free from the river to the sea. But I think Palestinian political prisoners need to be released, many of which are held indefinitely in Israeli jails without charge or trial. He says I think it's important here, he kind of sets the framing. Now, a decolonized Palestine can mean various things, and we can have discussions about what is an ethno-state and a nation-state and borders and all these things, but that's a discussion for another time. I have a few things that I think are pressing. I think Palestinian Palestinian political prisoners need to be released, many of which are held indefinitely in Israeli jails without charge or trial, and in many cases, the prosecution will tell the judge that we have damning evidence, we just can't show it to you. Sorry. And they'll be held indefinitely. I want them all released. I want the walls to come down. I want the 6 million Palestinian refugees to come home. I want land back. I want land back everywhere, not just in Palestine. I want redistribution of resources, and I want, obviously, freedom and dignity for all. I can't believe that's even a question. So I think that's how I think liberated Palestine can look like. I think it's very achievable. I refuse to live in a reality in which the subjugation and statelessness of millions and millions of people can just be business as usual. I refuse that giving people their full rights can be considered inconvenient or an inconvenience, or something that would beget the genocide of another group. I think it's just he didn't say that. I'm just adding that on there. I refuse to live in a reality like that. I think granting all those rights is an absolute necessity and is absolutely possible and doable. Very interesting interview. Go check it out on Jacobin.com with Muhammad Al-Kurd. All right, so we got for you guys today. Back on Friday with Hell Island.